Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The city of Nuremberg in the autumn of 1945 was a ghost. Its medieval heart, once a fairy tale landscape of timbered houses and Gothic spires, was now a jagged skeleton of stone, a panorama of ruin stretching to the horizon. The air, thick with the dust of pulverized buildings, carried a chill that had little to do with the coming winter. This was the city that had once been the ceremonial cradle of the Third Reich, the stage for Leni Riefenstahl's cinematic deification of Adolf Hitler, where hundreds of thousands had marched under seas of swastika banners, their voices united in a chorus of national fervor. Now it was a tombstone, a fitting backdrop for the final act of a tragedy that had consumed the world. Amidst this sprawling destruction, one building stood remarkably intact, the Palace of Justice. A sprawling, imposing structure of gray stone, it had survived the Allied bombing raids that had leveled nearly everything around it. And it was here, in courtroom 600, that a process was about to begin that was as audacious as it was unprecedented. The world, still reeling from a war that had claimed more than 60 million lives, was about to put an idea on trial. The idea was not just Nazism, but the very concept of aggressive war and state-sponsored extermination. The question hanging in the dusty air of Nuremberg was not simply about guilt or innocence. It was a question that cut to the core of civilization itself. After a cataclysm of this magnitude, is justice even possible? Or is vengeance the only language that remains? The initial impulse among the Allied leaders was for something far simpler, far more primal. For summary justice. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, a man who understood the brutal calculus of war, initially advocated for the top Nazi leadership to be identified and shot without trial. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, for whom mass execution was a routine tool of statecraft, heartily agreed. It was swift, it was final, and it avoided the messy complications of legal procedure. But the Americans, particularly Secretary of War Henry Stimson, argued for something different. He believed that a trial, a public and meticulously documented legal proceeding, was the only way to truly cauterize the wound that Nazism had inflicted upon the world. It was a chance not just to punish the guilty, but to create an unassailable historical record of their crimes, a record built from their own documents, their own words, that would stand as a permanent warning to future generations. This was a radical proposition. The men who would sit in the dock were accused of crimes so monstrous and on a scale so vast that the existing legal frameworks of the world had no words for them. They had operated within a sovereign state, often under the color of their own nation's laws. The very concept of putting the leaders of a defeated nation on trial before a tribunal of their conquerors was fraught with peril. It risked being dismissed as victor's justice, a cynical exercise in revenge dressed up in legal robes. But the alternative, a simple firing squad or a hangman's noose, would have left the why unanswered. It would have punished the men, but left their ideology to fester in the shadows, to be mythologized and revived. And so, the path was chosen. A trial would be held. A new kind of justice would be forged in the crucible of the world's greatest crime. Today, we dissect the anatomy of that justice. We explore how, in a ruined city, the world grappled with an evil that defied language, and in doing so, created a legal and moral precedent that echoes to this day. This is the anatomy of justice after genocide. Before any trial could begin, a foundation had to be laid. A legal architecture had to be built from scratch, designed to support the weight of unprecedented atrocities. In the summer of 1945, representatives from the four main Allied powers, the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France, gathered in London. Their task was to draft a charter for an international military tribunal, a court that would have the jurisdiction to try the major war criminals of the European Axis. The man leading the American delegation, and who would become the chief architect of the Nuremberg Trials, was Robert H. Jackson, a justice of the United States Supreme Court. Jackson was a brilliant lawyer and a powerful orator, possessed of a profound belief that the law could be a force for moral order in the world. He understood the stakes better than anyone. He argued that this could not be a mere political act. We must not forget that the record on which we judge these defendants today is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow, he warned. To pass these defendants a poisoned chalice is to put it to our own lips as well. The resulting document, the London Charter, was a revolutionary piece of international law. It established the constitution, jurisdiction, and functions of the tribunal. Most importantly, it defined the crimes for which the Nazi leaders would be tried. There were 4 counts. The first was conspiracy to commit the other 3 crimes. This was a crucial and uniquely American legal concept. It allowed the prosecution to weave together the entire history of the Nazi regime, from its violent rise to power in the 1930s to the final apocalyptic days in the Berlin bunker, into a single, overarching criminal enterprise. The goal was to prove that the Holocaust and the war were not a series of isolated acts, but the inevitable outcomes of a meticulously planned conspiracy. The second count was crimes against peace. This was perhaps the most radical innovation. It defined the planning, preparation, initiation, or waging of a war of aggression as a criminal act. For centuries, war had been seen as a sovereign right of nations, a tragic but legitimate tool of state policy. Nuremberg declared that starting a war for conquest was not a political act, but a crime. The third count was war crimes. This was more traditional territory, based on existing international laws like the Hague and Geneva Conventions. It covered acts like the murder of prisoners of war, the destruction of cities, and the use of slave labor. These were rules for how to behave in the savage business of war, rules the Nazis had violated with systematic cruelty. Finally, there was the fourth and most resonant count, crimes against humanity. This was the charge that addressed the unique horror of the Nazi project. It was defined as murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against any civilian population, before or during the war, or persecutions on political, racial, or religious grounds. This was the legal language, created to encompass the Holocaust, the systematic, industrialized slaughter of 6 million Jews and millions of others, Poles, Slavs, Roma, homosexuals, and political opponents. Crucially, it applied whether or not the acts were in violation of the domestic law of the country where they were perpetrated. It pierced the veil of national sovereignty, declaring that some actions are so heinous they are an offense against all of humanity, and the world has a right to intervene. This legal framework was not without its critics. The most potent argument against it was that it constituted ex post facto law, punishing people for acts that were not explicitly defined as crimes when they were committed. How could planning a war be a crime in 1939 if no international treaty had defined it as such? The defense lawyers would seize upon this argument, but the Allied prosecutors, led by Jackson, had a powerful counter. They argued that the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, a treaty signed by Germany and over 60 other nations, had already renounced war as an instrument of national policy. The crimes themselves, murder, enslavement, torture, were not new. They were, as Jackson would later say, the oldest and most savage of crimes. The novelty of Nuremberg was not in criminalizing these acts, but in applying individual responsibility to the statesmen and generals who had unleashed them on such a catastrophic scale. The Charter also preemptively dismantled the most predictable defense, that of superior orders. Article 8 of the Charter stated plainly, "The fact that the defendant acted pursuant to order of his government or of a superior shall not free him from responsibility. The defense of just following orders would not be a shield at Nuremberg." The stage was now set, the law was written, the defendants were chosen, and in the fall of 1945 they were brought to the city that was once the temple of their movement to face a new kind of reckoning. 22 men sat in the defendant's dock when the trial began on November 20, 1945. They were a cross-section of the Third Reich's elite, the surviving architects of a fallen empire. They were the military leaders, the diplomats, the industrialists, the ideologues. Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels had escaped the dock through suicide, but the men who remained represented the machinery of the Nazi state, and at the head of them all, seated at the front, number 1 in the dock, was Hermann Göring, the former Reichsmarschall, commander of the Luftwaffe, president of the Reichstag, and Hitler's designated successor, was the highest-ranking Nazi to face trial. Bloated and stripped of his medals and opulent uniforms, he had been weaned off the paracodeine to which he was addicted, and had lost a significant amount of weight in captivity. But his ego, his arrogance, and his sharp intellect remained. He saw the trial, not as a legal proceeding but as a final battle, a contest of wills with his captors, and he intended to win. He would be the defiant, unrepentant face of Nazism in the courtroom. Next to him sat Rudolf Hess, once Hitler's deputy. Hess had been a prisoner in Britain since 1941, when he had inexplicably flown a Messerschmitt to Scotland. On a bizarre, self-appointed peace mission, in the dock, he was a strange, spectral figure, claiming amnesia, his eyes hollow, his behavior erratic. Was he genuinely mad, or was it a clever act to escape judgment? The tribunal would have to decide. There was Joachim von Ribbentrop, the former foreign minister, a man whose arrogance was legendary even among the Nazis. He had been the architect of the pact with the Soviet Union that had cleared the way for the invasion of Poland and the start of the war. Now he appeared broken and bewildered, unable to comprehend his fall from grace. Wilhelm Keitel, the field marshal and chief of the Armed Forces High Command, sat stiffly in his uniform, the personification of the Prussian military tradition. He would be the archetype for the superior order's defense, a man who saw himself as a loyal soldier whose honor demanded obedience regardless of the nature of the command. One of the most complex and fascinating figures was Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect, and later the Minister of Armaments and War Production. Polished, intelligent, and articulate, Speer was the good Nazi in the public imagination. He presented himself as a technocrat, a man seduced by Hitler's charisma and the grand opportunities he was given, but who was ultimately unaware of the regime's worst horrors. Unlike most of the others, Speer accepted a degree of responsibility. He spoke of a collective guilt, a calculated strategy that he hoped would save his life. His testimony would provide a chilling insight into the inner workings of the Nazi elite. but the question of how much he truly knew, and how much he was willfully ignorant, would linger long after the trial. The defendants were a strange and disparate group. There was Alfred Rosenberg, the self-styled philosopher of the Nazi Party, whose pseudo-intellectual racist theories had provided the ideological justification for genocide. There was Hans Frank, the butcher of Poland, who had overseen a reign of terror as Governor-General. There was Julius Streicher, the publisher of the vile anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, a grotesque figure whose pornographic racism had poisoned the minds of millions of Germans. And there was Hjalmar Schacht, the brilliant economist who had engineered Germany's economic recovery in the 1930s, a man who claimed to have turned against Hitler and was now inexplicably in the dock alongside the men he professed to despise. Each of these men had played a critical role in the catastrophe. They were not, as the philosopher Hannah Arendt would later observe of another Nazi, Adolf Eichmann, merely banal cogs in a machine. These were the men who had designed the machine. They were the engineers of the Third Reich, and the prosecution was about to show the world the blueprints of their creation. The trial began, and with it, the monumental task of documenting a history that was still fresh, raw, and bleeding. The proceedings began on November 20th, 1945. The world's attention was fixed on courtroom 600. The room itself was a symbol of the new era. It had been modified for the occasion, with a new wall erected to separate the public gallery from the main floor. The defendants sat in 2 rows in a specially constructed dock, facing a panel of 8 judges, 2 from each of the 4 Allied nations. At the head of the American prosecution team, Justice Robert H. Jackson rose to deliver his opening statement. What he said that day has since become one of the most powerful and enduring speeches in the history of international law. It was not just a legal argument. It was a moral and philosophical indictment of the entire Nazi enterprise. The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility, he began, his voice calm but resonant. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. He laid out the prosecution's plan with stark clarity. This would not be a trial based on the testimony of the Nazis' enemies. The case against them would be built, piece by piece, from their own words, their own documents, their own films. The Nazis had been meticulous, obsessive record keepers. They had documented their own criminality with a bureaucratic precision that was, in itself, horrifying. The prosecution had amassed a mountain of this evidence, tons of captured documents, films, photographs, and official records. We will not ask you to convict these men on the testimony of their foes, Jackson declared. There is no count in the indictment that cannot be proved by books and records. We will show you their own films and their own photographs. The prosecution's strategy was to prove the conspiracy charge first, to establish that the entire Nazi regime was a criminal organization from its inception. They painstakingly traced the path from the beer hall putsch in Munich to the invasion of Poland, using Hitler's own writings in Mein Kampf, secret memoranda from meetings, and the diaries of key officials. They presented documents like the Hossbach Memorandum of 1937, a record of a secret meeting in which Hitler laid out his explicit plans for a war of conquest in Europe to achieve Lebensraum, or living space. This single document eviscerated any claim that Germany had stumbled into war or was merely acting in self-defense. It was premeditated, cold-blooded aggression, planned years in advance. The prosecution then moved from the crime of war to the crimes committed during it. The evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity was overwhelming and gut-wrenching. They presented affidavits, eyewitness accounts from survivors, and captured reports from the SS. They detailed the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads that had murdered over 1 million Jews in Eastern Europe. They presented evidence of the slave labor program, which had torn millions from their homes to work to death in German factories, a program overseen by defendants like Fritz Sauckel and Albert Speer. They read from the chilling Posen speech, in which Heinrich Himmler spoke frankly to a gathering of SS leaders about the extermination of the Jewish race, calling it a glorious page in our history. But the most powerful and damning evidence was visual. On the 9th day of the trial, the prosecutors darkened the courtroom and showed a 1-hour film titled Nazi Concentration Camps. It was a compilation of footage taken by Allied soldiers as they liberated the camps at Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and others in the spring of 1945. The film had no narration. It needed none. The images spoke for themselves. Skeletal survivors, their eyes wide with a trauma beyond comprehension. Piles of emaciated corpses being bulldozed into mass graves. The gas chambers, the crematoria, the warehouses filled with human hair, eyeglasses, and children's shoes. The effect in the courtroom was shattering. The defendants, who had until then maintained an air of defiant boredom or detached interest, were forced to confront the direct consequences of their actions. Hjalmar Schacht turned his back to the screen. Walther Funk, the former economics minister, wept openly. Hans Frank, the butcher of Poland, was seen rocking back and forth. Even Hermann Göring, who tried to maintain his composure, could not hide the flicker of shock and horror in his eyes. The world had heard rumors and reports, but seeing the reality documented on film was a different matter. It was irrefutable. It was the truth of the Holocaust projected onto a screen in a German courtroom, for the architects of that horror to see. The prosecution rested its case on this mountain of self-incrimination. They had, as Jackson promised, let the defendants' own records tell the story. Now it was time for the defense to offer a response to a truth that seemed, in that moment, unanswerable. When the defense began its case in the spring of 1946, it faced a seemingly impossible task. The prosecution had presented a meticulous and overwhelming case built almost entirely on the defendant's own documents. The core strategies of the defense were therefore limited. They focused on 3 main pillars: challenging the legitimacy of the court itself, denying knowledge of or responsibility for the atrocities, and claiming that they were merely following the orders of a superior, namely Adolf Hitler. The first argument, that the trial represented victor's justice, was a constant undercurrent. The defense lawyers argued that the International Military Tribunal was a creation of the winning side, applying new laws retroactively, and was therefore inherently biased. They employed the tu quoque defense, meaning you too. If waging an aggressive war was a crime, they asked, what about the Soviet Union's invasion of Finland and its occupation of eastern Poland, which was a direct result of the Nazi-Soviet pact? What about the Allied bombing campaigns that had devastated German cities like Dresden, killing tens of thousands of civilians? While these arguments raised uncomfortable questions about the conduct of the Allied powers, the judges ruled them inadmissible. The crimes of others, they stated, did not excuse the crimes of the defendants. The focus of this trial was the actions of the Nazi regime, and that focus would not be widened. The second strategy was one of denial and deflection. Most of the defendants claimed to have been ignorant of the full scale of the Holocaust. Albert Speer perfected this defense, portraying himself as an apolitical technocrat who was absorbed in his work of arming the German war machine. He claimed he had no direct knowledge of the final solution. Others, like the military leaders Keitel and Alfred Jodl, argued that they were professional soldiers, uninvolved in the political and racial policies of the regime. They claimed a strict separation between the military, the Wehrmacht, and the political organizations, like the SS, who had actually carried out the genocide. This was a lie, as the prosecution had shown extensive evidence of the army's complicity in atrocities on the Eastern Front, but it was the narrative they clung to. The third and most famous defense was Befehl ist Befehl. An order is an order. This was the superior order's defense. Defendant after defendant took the stand and claimed they had no choice but to obey the commands of Adolf Hitler. To have disobeyed, they argued, would have meant immediate execution for treason. Field Marshal Keitel was the poster child for this argument. He stated on the stand, "It is not the task of a soldier to act as a judge over his supreme commander. Let him be right or wrong." But the London Charter, the very foundation of the trial, had anticipated and explicitly rejected this defense. The principle established at Nuremberg was that there are some orders so manifestly immoral and illegal that no one has a duty to obey them. The law, the judges asserted, requires a person to make a moral choice. The plea of simply following orders was not a valid defense for participating in mass murder. The climax of the defense case, and indeed of the entire trial, was the testimony of Hermann Göring. He took the stand for almost 2 full days, and he was brilliant. He was charming, witty, defiant, and intellectually formidable. He admitted his loyalty to Hitler and took responsibility for his actions. But he framed them as patriotic duties, not crimes. He sparred with Justice Jackson, often getting the better of the American prosecutor, whose folksy courtroom style was no match for Göring's aggressive and knowledgeable defense of his own record. For a moment, it seemed as if Göring might succeed in turning the trial into a political spectacle, in which he would emerge as a martyr for the German people. He dominated the proceedings, and Jackson left the courtroom frustrated and humiliated by the exchange. The task of breaking Göring fell to the British prosecutor, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe. Unlike Jackson, Maxwell Fyfe was a master of methodical, relentless cross-examination. He did not try to match Göring's charisma. Instead, he buried him in an avalanche of facts, of documents, of Göring's own signatures on orders that directly led to persecution and murder. He confronted Göring with a document from 1941, an order he had signed empowering Reinhard Heydrich to organize the final solution to the Jewish question. There was no rhetoric, no sparring. There was only the document, the signature, and the inescapable conclusion. Under Maxwell Fyfe's precise and suffocating questioning, Göring's grand performance collapsed. He became evasive, contradictory, and was exposed not as a patriot, but as a central architect of the genocide. The momentum of the trial shifted decisively back to the prosecution. The defense had offered its explanations, its justifications, and its denials. Now, after nearly a year of testimony and evidence, it was time for judgment. After 216 days of trial, the court adjourned on August 31, 1946, for the judges to begin their deliberations. The 8 judges, a principal and an alternate from each of the 4 Allied powers, retreated into seclusion to weigh the mountain of evidence and the fate of the 21 men who now awaited their verdict. one defendant, Robert Ley, had committed suicide before the trial, and another, Gustav Krupp, was deemed medically unfit. The process was arduous and contentious. The judges had to reach a consensus on guilt or innocence for each defendant on each of the 4 counts, a total of 84 separate verdicts, and then decide on the sentences. The divisions between them often reflected the political and legal philosophies of their home countries. The Soviet judge, Iona Nikitchenko, who had presided over Stalin's show trials, was inclined towards guilt and the death penalty for all. The American and British judges were more steeped in the traditions of common law, with its emphasis on individual evidence and due process. Finally, on September 30, 1946, the defendants were brought back into courtroom 600 one last time to hear their fate. The reading of the judgments took 2 days. The court first declared several branches of the Nazi state, the SS, the Gestapo, the SD, the intelligence agency, and the leadership corps of the Nazi Party, to be criminal organizations. Membership in them was now, by definition, a crime. This was a sweeping condemnation of the very structure of the Nazi regime. Then came the individual verdicts. The sentences were announced on October 1st. The defendants were brought in one by one. The tension in the courtroom was absolute. 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death by hanging. This group included the most prominent figures: Hermann Göring, the unrepentant second-in-command; Joachim von Ribbentrop, the diplomat who had negotiated for war; Wilhelm Keitel, the field marshal who had signed illegal orders; Alfred Rosenberg, the racist ideologue; Hans Frank, the butcher of Poland; and Julius Streicher, the propagandist whose poisonous words had fueled the genocide. 3 defendants were sentenced to life in prison: Rudolf Hess, whose feigned or real madness did not absolve him of his role as Hitler's deputy; Walther Funk, the economics minister who had helped finance the war and profited from stolen Jewish assets; and Erich Raeder, the commander of the Navy. 4 others received prison sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years, including Albert Speer. His calculated acceptance of responsibility, combined with his testimony against the others, had saved him from the gallows. He received a sentence of 20 years. Perhaps the most shocking part of the verdict was the 3 acquittals: Hjalmar Schacht, the economist; Franz von Papen, the conservative politician who had helped Hitler become chancellor; and Hans Fritz, a radio propagandist, were all found not guilty. The acquittals stunned many observers, particularly the Soviets. How could anyone who had held a position of power in the Third Reich be found innocent? But the acquittals were, in a strange way, a powerful validation of the trial itself. They proved that this was not a show trial with a predetermined outcome. It was a genuine legal proceeding where evidence was weighed, and if the prosecution failed to prove its case against an individual beyond a reasonable doubt, that individual would go free. It demonstrated that the court was governed by law, not by a thirst for vengeance. The executions were scheduled for the early hours of October 16, 1946, in the gymnasium of the Nuremberg prison. But there was one final act of defiance. 2 hours before he was due to be hanged, Hermann Göring committed suicide in his cell, cheating the hangman by biting down on a hidden cyanide capsule. The remaining 10 condemned men went to the gallows one by one. Their final words were a mixture of defiance, piety, and delusion. "Heil Hitler!" cried Julius Streicher as he was led to the scaffold. "I hope that this execution is the last act of the tragedy of the Second World War," said Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Nazi commissioner for the Netherlands, "and that the lesson taken from this world war will be that peace and understanding should exist between the peoples. The last to be executed was Hans Frank, who had converted to Catholicism in his cell. "I pray to God to receive my soul," he said. Their bodies were cremated, and their ashes were secretly scattered into the Isar River, to ensure that no grave would ever become a shrine. The main Nuremberg trial was over, but its legacy, the principles it had established, and the debates it had ignited, was just beginning. The Nuremberg Trials were far more than the final chapter of the Second World War. They were a beginning. They were an audacious, imperfect, and ultimately indispensable attempt to confront the darkest capabilities of human civilization with the rule of law. In dissecting the anatomy of this process, we see not just a trial of 22 men, but a landmark effort to reshape the very foundations of international relations and to establish a new understanding of justice, sovereignty, and human rights. The core achievement of Nuremberg was the establishment of a principle that individuals, no matter how powerful their position, can be held criminally responsible for crimes against international law. It forever shattered the defense that one was simply acting as an agent of the state. It declared that sovereignty is not a license to commit genocide. The legal precedents born in that German courtroom became the bedrock of modern international criminal law. The Nuremberg Principles, affirmed by the United Nations General Assembly in 1946, codified the concepts of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. They paved the way for the Genocide Convention of 1948, which for the first time made the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial or religious group, an international crime. They laid the groundwork for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the later Geneva Conventions, which expanded protections for civilians and prisoners of war. And decades later, the spirit of Nuremberg would be resurrected in the ad hoc tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and ultimately in the creation of a permanent international criminal court, a body dedicated to prosecuting the same kinds of unimaginable crimes that the world first confronted in 1945. Of course, the trial was not without its flaws, and it has been criticized since the day it began. The charge of victor's justice has never entirely faded. The fact that the tribunal was composed solely of judges from the winning powers, and that it chose not to examine the war crimes of the Allies, remains a legitimate point of contention. The inclusion of the Soviet Union, a totalitarian regime with its own staggering record of atrocities, on the judicial bench was a deep and troubling irony. And the hope that Nuremberg would end all wars of aggression has tragically not been realized in the decades since. The world is still plagued by conflict, by atrocity, and by genocide. But to judge Nuremberg solely by its imperfections, or by its failure to create a perfect world, is to miss its profound and enduring significance. It was an act of faith in the power of reason and law, in the face of utter barbarism. It was a refusal to answer atrocity with more atrocity. The prosecution could have relied solely on survivor testimony, on an emotional appeal to the world's conscience. Instead, they chose the harder path. They built their case on the cold, hard evidence of the Nazis' own bureaucracy of death. They used the perpetrators' own meticulous records to condemn them, creating an undeniable, unassailable, historical account of the Holocaust and the crimes of the Third Reich. They ensured that history could not be easily rewritten, that the victims would not be silenced, and that the crime of genocide could never again be dismissed as a mere byproduct of war. In the end, The Palace of Justice in Nuremberg was more than a courtroom. It was a laboratory, where the world attempted the difficult, imperfect, and eternal alchemy of transforming unimaginable horror into universal law. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.